Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be talking about the books that I read in the month of June. I had a lot of reading plans for the month of June, but I ended up reading 5 books, and that's all, which isn't terrible, but I wanted to read like 5 books the first half of the month, so it feels kind of bad. So I'm gonna go over the books that I read and then the books that I started, which I think I worked on more books than I read, which is fine, I guess. First, I have the only book that I finished for Readorama and Queerlit Readathon. And that is SuperMutant Magic Academy by Jillian Tamaki. And unfortunately, I did not really vibe with this. This is more of a comic series than a book. It focuses on a lot of different people within this magic academy. It wasn't really clear to me if like only some people were magic. Everyone definitely had different abilities, but like I don't really know much about the world, and usually, world building is pretty low on my list. But it was just really obvious, like I didn't understand the world, and not in a whimsical way, but more in a, I don't know, it was unclear. It just wasn't very well done, because I like a lot of sci-fi books that don't have very explicit world building. And a lot of them feel more like fantasy to me, like it was okay that I didn't understand, but with this, I was just unsure of like the context of the school at all. There also wasn't much of a very clear storyline until the end. Like, there are certain characters where it was clear that there was sort of a storyline. The main people, Wendy and Marcia for sure, and then a couple of other secondary characters. Like, there were a couple of little story arcs in the beginning, I guess, or you could tell that there was some sort of pattern to it, but a lot of the scenes with the other people, or even sometimes with them, were just like random and didn't really make sense to me very much. Now I will say the last half of the book I liked better. Up until honestly like 2/3 of the way through the book, I was like, this is like a 2-star read. But the last bit actually bumped it up for me because there was more of an actual storyline. And again, like, plot usually isn't my thing. I could read a book about characters doing nothing as long as I know who the characters are. And because the first half of this book is so chaotic and flips from character to character and person to person, like I didn't know how half of the characters were connected until the end, and even then a lot of the characters I still don't know and I still don't really understand. So because it didn't have a very good foundation of like characters and really liking the characters, there were 2 that I was invested in, and they were the 2 that ended up being focused on at the end, which was good, I guess. But that's still like a lot of stuff that I just didn't really care about reading at the beginning. I do like the when there was an actual story present, it was interesting. So like the main thing with Marcia and Wendy and all the wild stuff that happens at the end, that was cool. If that had been a book all on its own, I think I would have really enjoyed it. But because it was like a series of comics about the chaos that happens at the school without actually understanding why the school is there, and with no knowledge of the characters, it just didn't feel that great. So I think I ended up giving it 2.5 stars. Another thing that kind of bothered me with it, like, not only, it wasn't just the story not necessarily holding up, but there was a lot of this that felt dated in a bad way. Like, some of the humor, like, kind of aged poorly. And I thought that this was written earlier than it was. So the fact that this was released in like 2015, there were a couple of jokes in here and a couple of things that I was like, oh, this feels a little bit more like if I had seen some of this Like, if it had been written when I was in high school, which I graduated in 2011. So if I had seen something published then or before, I would be like, okay, I get why the joke is there, because that was the time of 2015. There were a couple of jokes and things like that that just felt kind of icky. So that was this book. If you like stuff that's maybe more like serialized, or you get bits and pieces, then you could read it. If you like the art style, you could read it. But it just wasn't really for me. Next, I finished a buddy read. I read The New Queer Conscience by Adam Ely with Wilma from Life Goofer. And this was a very short nonfiction. I was expecting a bit more. My bar was probably set high because I really liked Alok's book in the same collection, Beyond the Gender Binary. And this one, I think, introduced a really good idea. Like, his whole premise is that as a queer person who is also Jewish, whenever something happens in the Jewish community, there are a lot of people to back them up. And he didn't see that same sort of intergroup solidarity in the LGBT community, and he proposes that we need that, especially on a global level. I'm stoked about that. Love solidarity, love coming together, but the points that he made were super basic, I thought. If you've never considered this before, or if you're some of the people who engage in discourse just to be an asshole to other people, certainly you would need this. There are a lot of people who could actually use integrating this idea, but I just wish that he'd had more tangible goals, other than just like, be nice to people, especially like the global piece. I was hoping that he would have things to say about like organizing and stuff like that, but it was all very surface level, which maybe makes sense since this is very small and it's YA, but like, I feel like most kids who are interested in activism would already know this, especially like I go on TikTok and see like 19-year-olds who have a whole ass account where they're talking about like the intricacies of leftism, which is far and beyond anything that I was at as a 19-year-old. So perhaps this is just for people who are like very much being introduced to stuff. All that is to say, there is an audience for this. I definitely wasn't that audience, and I would love to see this idea expanded more and actually see how we can integrate this in a more tangible way. Next, I read the audiobook of Untamed by Glennon Doyle. Why is that focused on that? Oh, that makes lighting way better. Or brighter. I don't know how to use a fucking camera. Whatever. Okay. Next, I read the audiobook of Untamed by Glennon Doyle. In this memoir, she talks about falling in love with her wife as she is at the very end of her marriage with her husband before, who she'd previously written a book about. So this was kind of interesting, especially, like I talked about last month, that I was reading Nagata Kabi's books, and I really liked that she had a lot of like meta about writing memoir. So I thought that that was really interesting in this as well. I think I would have been more interested if I had read and been invested in her previous books, but I didn't really want to read them. I was interested in Untamed because it was so popular, but I was like, the only thing that I knew going in was that she'd had a husband before, divorced, and fell in love with her wife. I'm not sure how she identifies, if she identifies as a lesbian or not. A lot of the stuff she described sounded like compet to me, but I'm not the person to make that call. I wonder if Wikipedia has her answer. I don't know. She puts a label on her sexuality, and it's, I guess, not my business. So, she talks at length about how other people's expectations really impacted her, and, like, why she ended up living the life that she did, and why she ended up going into drugs and alcohol, which I guess she talks about in her previous ones, but she talked about earlier in her life struggling with addiction, and the impact that finding someone and actually like falling in love really had on her, and her decision to definitively divorce her husband and follow what actually made her happy. So that's kind of her story. She also talks about allyship a bit, specifically like as a white person being an ally to the Black community. That piece of the book felt weird. I don't think that that's a bad thing to talk about, because I do think that for some people, like especially like having to actively like figure your stuff out and doing reflection, looking at internal biases and trying to actively be an ally to other people can kind of come with that. For me personally, the only reason I really started like self-reflecting enough to figure out that I was gay was trying to self-reflect on potential internal biases for other groups. So initially I thought, oh, this is cool because like it's neat to see people doing that, but the way that she talked about it was kind of weird. Like she talked about how she had set up an anti-racism workshop, presumably with no Black women or Black people, and got in some trouble for that, and she talked about like dealing with the backlash, and a lot of it was saying like that she like kind of wasn't doing it right and had to listen to other people. But a lot of it felt a little bit weird, especially when like after that she went and talked about how all of these people near her, like her sister and like other people, were doing stuff for marginalized communities. She wasn't bragging on herself, but it felt kind of like bragging, and it rubbed me the wrong way. So that part was weird. I feel kind of bad because I'm spending a lot of time on these books that I didn't like, but I only read 5 things and 2 of them weren't that good. Like, not like, this wasn't bad, but there were a lot of areas that were less desirable. I guess the main thing that like made me feel less good about this book was the fact, like, obviously memoirs are going to be very self-focused, but when you're talking about allyship and activism, it's going to be a lot more sturdy if you talk about that in community, to a certain extent. So, like, talking about what other people have said too, bringing in other theory or other proposed solutions. Who were you listening to? What were you reading about? Like, what were you doing? Who were you listening to? And there was really none of that. None of that when talking about anti-racism. None of that when even talking about, like, reflecting on herself, on her queerness. She also talks about how she realizes how much pressure her son must be under because of the way the masculinity is. She's thinking about this when he's like a teenager. She's like 40 and has never thought about that, which is fine. People learn at their own pace, but if you're in the middle of self-reflecting on sexuality and on societal expectations, it is unfathomable to me why you would not want to read about other people's experiences. There's so much stuff out there. Like, gender studies exist at the very least. I don't know. It just felt weird to me. I kind of wanted to shake her and be like, dude, read something. And I'm sure that she has, and I feel like I wasn't in the best mood when reading the first half of this month. So maybe that's where some of the attitude came from, but it just made me a little tired. That's not to say that it's not a good book for some people. I actually thought of 2 different people who I would definitely recommend it to. Like I said, her figuring out herself, like that piece of the story I think was good, and it's really important to talk about. Not just like the act of like figuring yourself out sexuality wise, but being able to get out of situations that you know aren't good for yourself, get out of marriages that aren't good for yourself, especially after having kids. A lot of people stay in situations that they shouldn't because of that. So I think that's really good representation, especially as something that's nonfiction. So I think that can really be valuable. So I do think that it's a good book. It just wasn't for me. After that, I read a book that Glennon Doyle blurbed. I didn't buy it because she blurbed it. I bought it, it's been on my mind since before it actually came out. But I read Outlove, a queer Christian survival story by Julie Rodgers. This is another memoir that's about her experience being in fundamentalist evangelical spaces as a lesbian. She talks about growing up with a mom who homeschooled her until high school. She came out as a lesbian at 16 and was brought to a church that had a conversion therapy program, and she went through that and grew a really close relationship with one of the people in charge of it. Like, she talks a lot about how he felt like another parental figure. It seemed really codependent, so not great stuff. And then she talks about how she went into another program, so she worked with both programs. The Exodus International was the other one that she was a part of. And that one famously, I don't know if it's shut down or if it just stopped doing the conversion therapy piece, after the person who started the program realized how much damage it was doing. So she talked about being in those, and then after she came out of those, even when she wasn't, like, she disagreed with conversion therapy, but she still stayed in fundamentalist circles and started working in a college before realizing basically that she was being taken advantage of and tokenized. And then actually, like, finding somebody and falling in love and all that. She talks about how complicated her emotions were during all of this. You know, being in spaces where you're being heavily manipulated, like, you're going to have a multitude of emotions, and especially, like, reflecting on it, you're going to feel maybe a little bit different than during it, or you'll see different things than beforehand. She also talks about, you know, not only how it impacted her and her mental health, but she talks about some of the other people that she found afterwards and how it had really impacted them. People who had fallen into drug addiction and things like that because of the way that the program treated them and the really dangerous habits that it created. This is definitely, you know, her perspective. So this isn't like the, I guess, like, end-all be-all book on that sort of thing. That's not what it's trying to be. But I still felt like it was a really important perspective, and it has certainly given me a lot to think about. It was really interesting seeing her trajectory, especially, like, starting out, really not wanting to go in the programs and then getting caught up in it so much. And also her experience in fundamentalist spaces afterwards. She was involved in a lot of these spaces before Trump era. I think that she talks about getting out of them, and then, like, immediately seeing the rise of, like, Trump. So people were so pressed about having a openly celibate lesbian in their spaces and being super homophobic, but then turning to an adulterer and open sexual predator as their candidate of choice. So she kind of talks about that a bit. It would have been interesting to see some of these things expanded, especially, like, it would have been interesting to see, like, theological perspectives maybe talked about a little bit more, but that's not ultimately, I guess, what this was about, which is totally fine. I think it's interesting to think about her choices when writing this, especially because one of the things that happened within the conversion therapy spaces was her testimony being kind of manipulated. Like, they would help her write it and insinuate that certain things were more causal than they actually were. So it's interesting to think, like, after that sort of experience, how would constructing your own story feel? Which isn't something that she talks about, but it's definitely something that I thought about a lot while reading it. So I think this is a very important book. She wrote it very gently, I think, to the people in the fundamentalist spaces. Like, she definitely talked about how it was like a systemic problem, and a lot of the people involved in the conversion therapy programs were queer or same-sex attracted, or struggling. A lot of them were struggling. And she's also very kind even to the people who abused her and allowed her to be abused in this situation. I think that this has the potential to reach out to people who are still in those spaces. Definitely, queer people who are in conversion therapy. And maybe some people who aren't queer who are in those spaces. That piece, I'm less sure about, because I actually had a conversation with one of those people earlier this month about conversion therapy. And let's just say that it did not go super well. We love a relative that may or may not be in a pseudo cult. But the people who are on the fence and are open to hearing about things without calling them inherently demonic for disagreeing with their preacher, this could bring some people into the light, especially since this is a personal account, rather than a study, which seems counterintuitive, but hearing about it from somebody who is in their in-group, I think, has the potential to talk some sense into some folks. So I think I gave this 4 stars. And finally, I have a book that I started last month, finished this month, The Anthropocene Reviewed by John Green, which I absolutely adored. I knew that I was going to like it. I've been a fan of the podcast for a while. I've been a fan of John Green for much longer. I started watching the Vlogbrothers in 2011, so literally a decade. And I think this, as well as the Anthropocene Reviewed podcast, have very much Thoughts from Places video vibes, but taken up to the next level. In this, he is writing essays focusing on basically just random things within the human world. He talks about the history, sometimes he talks about how it's personal to him, and rates it, although the ratings are not the most important part. The analysis and discussion is really interesting. Part of it's the informational bit, which is cool, but really the element of this that really makes it for me is that he's connecting it to the world in a broader sense. Even when he's talking about how it relates to him personally, it still feels broad, because you're seeing how something so big can impact people on an individual level, and this is just him talking about his experience. So the fact that a song could be that personal to one person makes you think about how it could be so personal to so many other people. That sort of a thing. As he's talking about a lot of this, especially in the beginning, he's also connecting it to current events. So he talks about 2020, because that's when he was editing a fair amount of this, was in the middle of lockdown. So some of the essays are connected to that. There are other things that he brings up too that are really heavy. So I think overall this essay collection made me feel much more connected to the world, or at least wanting that connection. But he's not, it's not all happy-go-lucky, isn't the world all good and amazing? He mentions systemic issues, he mentions grief, he talks about being incredibly depressed. I think it makes it all feel less fake. It makes the positive things that he says have more impact because he is clearly thinking about the negative and has dealt with the negative. And at being able to see those sparks despite that is really incredible to me, especially because I feel like have been in a place that's more pessimistic. So being able to see that pessimism within this, but also being able to see strings of optimism and strings of beauty, that was really important. I think this section might highlight some of what I'm trying to say. This is at the end of his essay on sunsets on page 99. It can sometimes feel like loving the beauty that surrounds us is somehow disrespectful to the many horrors that also surround us. But mostly I think I'm just scared that if I show the world my belly, it will devour me. And so I wear the armor of cynicism and hide behind the great walls of irony and only glimpse beauty with my back turned to it, through the clawed glass. But I want to be earnest even if it's embarrassing. The photographer Alex Soth has said, "To me, the most beautiful thing is vulnerability." I would take that a step further and argue that you cannot see the beauty, which is enough, unless you make yourself vulnerable to it. And so I try to turn towards that scattered light, belly out, and I tell myself, this doesn't look like a picture, and it doesn't look like a god. It is a sunset, and it is beautiful. And this whole thing you've been doing where nothing gets 5 stars because nothing is perfect, that's bullshit. So much is perfect. Starting with this. I give sunsets 5 stars. There are so many other sections where he says stuff that's, like, essential to, like, what I'm trying to say about the book. But this would just turn into me reading a bunch of excerpts of it, so I'll just leave it at that one. This is incredible, and it made me feel so many things. It's hard to say what my favorite essay in this is, because, like, the essay on sunsets fucked me up. I mean, a lot of the essays fucked me up. Googling strangers was really great. But one that really hit me towards the end was New Partner, the one on the song New Partner, which I was not familiar with, but he talks about different memories that he had regarding the song, and I just found that so profound. I think especially because I've been thinking a lot about certain pieces of music and what they've meant to me. In particular, I have a lot of feelings about the album Tallahassee by the Mountain Goats, which I'm not about to sit and talk about. It hit me. It gave me a lot of feelings. I really adored it. If I talk about it anymore, we're going to be here all day. I did want to vlog my way through this book, but that simply did not happen. I wanted to vlog my way through this and through Dan's book, but, nothing was really happening this month. So I may do a full review on this, even though who knows how long I've talked about it in this wrap-up. But I may go more into detail. Maybe every time I talk about a video, I feel like only half the time ends up happening, so I might do a full review on this. I feel like I've spent more time talking about each book this time than usual. But these are the things that I actually finished, plus the audiobook. Now, the things that I started, we had quite a few. You Will Get Through This Dark Night by Dan Howell is a buddy read that I'm doing. We only got through page 40 or so, 40 or 50, to part 1, so we got through the introductory stuff. I need to figure out if we're actually going to talk about the introduction or not, because if not, I would really like to continue reading it. I also started an Unkindness of Ghosts. I'm actually listening to it on audiobook because my brain hasn't been working. And it's really good so far. I thought that it was going to be really good. I've read The Deep, which was excellent, and I've heard nothing but great stuff about this. The whole premise of this is that the main character is living on a spaceship, and the spaceship is tiered and set up like the antebellum South. So our main character lives towards the bottom, but is a healer and works with the surgeon, so she gets to see a little bit more. You're learning about kind of the different cultures on each deck through the writing, which I think is really interesting. And I'd really like to know how it mimics maybe some stuff in real life, because this is clearly talking not just about slavery, but also saying stuff outside of that and even to modern day. I don't want to say too much about, like, the plot, partly because I'm not done and partly because I don't want to spoil anything. I came into this not really knowing much beyond what I've just said, and I'm really enjoying it. I started that during the Queer Blackathon 48-hour readathon. I also started Dear Senthuran by Akwaeke Emezi, which is mind-blowing so far. This is a memoir written in an epistolary format, so they're writing letters to people within their life. I'm only on page 46, and I think that's largely because my brain was not working very well when I started to read it. It is incredible. The writing is incredible. I don't really know what else to say about it thus far, but I'll be finishing that. I also read a little bit of Polar Vortex by Shani Mootoo. I don't have any other thoughts, really, since the last time I talked about it and my previous wrap-up. I'm still not that far all the way through it yet. I started my arc of Rise to the Sun, which I got through work. I was reading this in the beginning of the month when my brain was really not doing the thing, so I just haven't picked it back up since then. In theory, I would like to read it at the beginning of this month. In theory. And then I also read a little bit of Audre Lorde's Sister Outsider. I finished the interview that she did with Adrienne Rich that was in here, and that had a lot of really good stuff in it, and like she references so much of the other stuff that she wrote, and that really makes me want to get into that, especially her poetry. And then The Master's Jewels Will Never Dismantle the Master's House, which I've read before and is great, but I've still got a lot more of this to read. So that's my wrap up. I finished a few things, worked on even more. I had a really hard time concentrating in general. Spent a lot of time on TikTok, though. I've been making TikToks because it feels like something that I can, like, start and finish immediately. And that's just been working for me in my brain. So yeah, in the comments, let me know what you've been reading, and thank you all so much for watching. Bye. So that's fine. I wish that my hair would just stay like this all the time. Like it's a little bit curly. Okay, it looks less good without the hat. But it's been doing... Oh no, did I mess up the flip? Because that was really cool. I feel like the skater boys in 2009 would be a little jealous. I don't know, kitten. What do you think? You just got cat snot all over my book.